They attacked in the dark, they struck in the rain, they advanced through mud, snow, and freezing water, and when they came, they didn't stop for casualties, didn't wait for backup, and didn't retreat. These weren't the words of panicked recruits or war propaganda. They came from the quiet, cold evaluations of German field commanders, men who had faced nearly every army in Europe and survived. When those veterans spoke of fear, they did not speak of tanks or airplanes. They spoke of the Canadian infantry. To the Wehrmacht and the fanatical Waffen SS, the Western Front in World War II was a nightmare of industrialized warfare. But within that nightmare, there was a hierarchy of dread. The Americans brought a wave of mass production. Their tanks and planes arrived in endless columns. The British brought a legacy of empire, trained, disciplined, methodical, unshakable. But when the enemy saw the maple leaf patch creeping toward their lines, there was no confusion about what they were facing. The Canadians weren't just a threat, they were a reckoning. The question echoes across the military archives. Why? Why did the masters of Blitzkrieg, the most efficient army of the era, fear a relatively small volunteer army from a distant dominion across the Atlantic? Why did internal German assessments rate Canadian troops as more dangerous in close quarters than their American and British counterparts? Why did commanders caution replacements not to surrender to the wild men from the north? The answer, as with many truths in war, cannot be found on a strategy map. It is buried in the mud of the Scheldt, in the shattered bones of Ortona, and in the blood-soaked fields of Normandy. This was no accident of reputation. This was a legacy forged in violence. To understand it, one must first shed the modern image of Canada. Today's Canada, the global peacekeeper, the gentle diplomat, the land of kindness, is a post-war invention. In 1939, Canada was still finding its identity. But on the battlefields of Europe, it found it in the most violent way imaginable. Unlike the vast conscript armies of the United States or the war-weary ranks of Britain, the Canadian military was compact. It fielded only 5 infantry divisions and 2 armored brigades in Europe. But what it lacked in size, it made up for with a terrifying concentration of discipline, aggression, and resolve. Canadian troops trained for years in Britain before ever landing in France or Italy. When they finally entered combat, they were not green. They were hardened, primed, coiled springs waiting to strike. Canadian doctrine emphasized what would later be known as shock infantry tactics: fast, overwhelming, relentless. German defenders quickly realized this wasn't a force that fought for ground, it fought to dominate. A Canadian platoon wouldn't wait for ideal weather, wouldn't hold back until artillery softened up the enemy, and wouldn't hesitate when a flanking maneuver might have saved lives. They came head-on through hail, rain, machine gun fire, and mud, and they didn't stop until the job was done or every man had fallen. Captured intelligence from the German 71st Infantry Division reveals a sentiment repeated across the front. The Americans kill you with their equipment, the British kill you with their professionalism, the Canadians kill you because they want to. Canadian infantrymen became feared for their relentlessness. Where most armies paused at night, the Canadians became nocturnal predators. They adapted to the dark, raided under cover of rainstorms, and appeared without warning in the very trenches their enemies had believed were safe. Their movements had a ghost-like quality, stealthy yet direct, precise yet primal. This unpredictability was psychologically devastating to German troops. They were used to structure, cadence, and timing. Canadian soldiers shattered that rhythm. A report from a panzer division noted that the Canadians do not recognize the natural pauses of battle. They are always moving, always attacking. The fear went deeper than tactics. It was rooted in the Canadians' refusal to yield. In battles where most armies might fall back, the Canadians held. They absorbed horrific losses, yet they did not bend. At Verrières Ridge, for example, against the elite 1st SS Panzer Corps, the Canadians were hit with waves of Tiger tanks and fanatic infantry. They held the line. They bled heavily, but they stood. To the Germans, so steeped in strategic logic, this kind of defiance was infuriating. It turned a battle into a war of attrition, and the Wehrmacht was running out of men. But for the Canadians, it wasn't just about ground, it was about identity. Each soldier carried the weight of a country trying to prove it belonged on the world stage. When fighting the Canadians, the Germans saw not just an opponent, but a predator. The close-quarters combat in battles like Ortona, where Canadian soldiers used a tactic called mouse-holing to tunnel from building to building through walls rather than risk sniper fire on the street, was ferocious. Grenades, bayonets, and knives were the weapons of choice in hand-to-hand struggles that shook even seasoned German paratroopers. In one case, a German commander was so bewildered by the tactics that he wrote, "They move like termites through concrete and fight like wolves in a pit." That image stuck. The Canadians were not only brutal in assault, they were exact in defense. Their artillery was legendary. Borrowing tactics from the First World War, Canadian gunners could lay down precise creeping barrages just meters in front of their infantry. German troops learned quickly. When the Canadian shelling stopped, the enemy was already upon them. The Wehrmacht came to fear that timing. "If the shelling ends," read one report, "do not raise your head. The Canadians are already inside the wire." Their fear peaked during the grimmest campaigns, those where other Allied forces faltered. The Battle of the Scheldt was one such crucible, tasked with clearing flooded estuaries and dike defenses to open the port of Antwerp. The terrain was a nightmare. Waterlogged fields, knee-deep mud, freezing rain, and fortified German bunkers. The British and Americans were committed elsewhere. It fell to the Canadians to attack. They did, and they didn't stop. They advanced in water up to their waists, across open causeways swept by machine gun fire, through storms and shrapnel. They crawled over barbed wire, flanked pillboxes through water, and returned fire from trenches that barely stayed above the rising tide. The Germans called it the Swamp of Death. For the Canadians, it was just another assignment. They paid in blood. But they broke the German line. One German officer would later remark, "The Canadian soldier does not need comfort, he needs a target." The reputation of Canadian fury deepened further after the SS executed captured Canadian prisoners at the Abbaye d'Ardennes in Normandy. The response was swift and brutal. The unwritten rules of war dissolved. From that point on, in battles against the Waffen SS, the phrase "no prisoners" passed through Canadian units with grim certainty. This wasn't just war anymore. It was payback. The Germans noticed. Desperate to avoid the wrath of Canadian units, many began surrendering to British or American forces when possible. Facing the Canadians became synonymous with facing certain death. A captured German officer from the 12th SS Panzer Division said it plainly during interrogation. The Canadians fought like they had hate in their blood. Fear became official policy. In German communications, units were warned that if Canadians attacked, reinforcement would likely come too late. One infamous report reads, "If the Americans attack, request artillery. If the British attack, request reinforcements. If the Canadians attack, say your prayers." By the end of the war, the Canadian forces had fought through Italy, stormed Juno Beach, survived the hell of Normandy's hedgerows, and carved a trail through the Netherlands and Germany. They had liberated towns, cracked fortresses, and built a reputation that outpaced their numbers. They were not just soldiers, they were the blade edge of the Allied spear. A compact force that bled harder, struck faster, and stayed longer than anyone expected. In comparison, German assessments of the other Allied powers often followed predictable patterns. The Americans, for all their power, were described as brave but inexperienced. Their strength was in logistics, a factory-driven juggernaut. The British were respected as professionals but war-weary, cautious, and predictable. But the Canadians defied classification. They fought with British precision, American aggression, and a uniquely Canadian refusal to retreat. They were the storm that came when all else failed. And for all the fear they inspired, they earned something rarer still: respect. In the ruins of Europe, amid the shattered cities and muddy fields, Canadian soldiers had forged more than victory. They had forged a national legacy, one soaked in sweat, fire, and blood. As the war came to an end, one German general summed up the entire experience of fighting this unlikely menace from the north. He didn't speak of technology, nor numbers, nor maps. He spoke of what his soldiers felt in the dark, waiting for a sound in the rain. When the Americans came, we fought machines. When the British came, we fought strategy. But when the Canadians came, we fought men. And in that fight, more than once, the Wehrmacht flinched.